48 other states couldn't be wrong, okay? And it's not fair just for two states, South Carolina and Wyoming, not to have a hate crime law.
Well, with that said, the State House session's getting closer to the finish line every day, and still no significant talk about a hate crime law. After a development this week, though, in a high-profile case, we look at the status.
Here we go with the majority deciding to bestow an honor on somebody who is totally, in my view, unworthy.
Some of the State House say it's a road to nowhere. House lawmakers are approving a plan to name part of an interstate after President Trump, while some leaders argue there are others we should be honoring first.
It removes the religious liberties of the people in South Carolina, and it's just outright un-American.
To get the shot or not. As the state's measles outbreak keeps soaring, there's a move at the State House that would require vaccines for all students in public schools, no exceptions. And not everyone likes that lesson plan.
Plus, the Attorney General Alan Wilson's in the studio. We're going to ask him about that issue and several others, the attack on Iran, what it means for South Carolina, plus his position in the race for governor. It is another Sunday in South Carolina. I'm Brian McConkey.
I'm Catherine Glenn Foster.
And I'm Dave Wilson here in the nation's capital. Connect to the Capitol starts right now.
And it's not fair just for two states, South Carolina and Wyoming, not to have a hate crime law.
Most of the time, South Carolina's penalties are more severe than many other places that have hate crimes laws, even with the hate crimes law attached.
A now decade-old debate in South Carolina continues, the lack of a hate crime law. The conversation first started after one of the most horrific crimes this century, when white supremacist Dylan Roof gunned down 9 black parishioners at historic Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston in 2015. And here we are, 11 years later. We are still talking about this and have many times here on Connect to the Capitol. Welcome into another Sunday morning here. I, of course, am in the capital of South Carolina. Dave Wilson and Catherine Glenn Foster in the capital of this country. We hope you're doing well this morning. So here's where we begin. We had that Richland County case, guys, that from back in the summer, where Richland County had that history-making ordinance, first person to get charged under it, this week decides they're going to plead guilty to a federal hate crime charge. Thus, the conversation begins at the House of State. Why haven't we done that yet in South Carolina? Just 2 states that haven't. Where do we begin?
As you said, this is especially timely right now because just this past Wednesday, we saw the person from over the summer plead guilty to federal charges. But the question here isn't really whether hate crimes are evil, whether the underlying crime is evil. The hate crime is evil. Hate is evil. But the question is, what problem are we trying to solve? Because we already have laws against murder, vandalism, assault. And so the debate really is about enhanced penalties and the motive here. And so we do want a legislature to be careful when criminal law starts punishing thoughts or motivations instead of the action. And then when we have the federal government stepping in, it can solve that gap, but it also raises federalism questions. If Washington is prosecuting these cases anyway, then what problem exactly are we trying to solve?
And that's the confusion, because as we've talked about before, it becomes layer upon layer upon layer of the types of criminal offenses, the types of charges that can be done. And that can get very confusing because, Catherine, to your point, there are federal hate crimes legislation, but what is it that raises a crime from a state crime to a federal crime?
Right. And we also need to remember that criminal law already allows judges to consider motive and other factors at sentencing. And so bias, cruelty, that already can impact a sentence and increase penalties. And so really one of the things we need to be discussing is consistent enforcement, not just laws that possess a symbolic value and are duplicative of what we already have at the federal level.
Exactly.
Yeah, the current status of that bill right now, there is one in play at the State House, but it's sitting in a committee right now in the House. So no word yet on whether it'll actually get to the House floor. They'll certainly vote on it if it does. But if they do approve it, it goes to the Senate, where it certainly gets locked up, as it has the time that it was passed. We're going to ask the Attorney General Alan Wilson about this particular issue coming up a few segments from now. But coming up next, another controversial issue on Thursday at the State House: resolutions passed that would honor both President Donald Trump and the late Charlie Kirk by naming portions of highways after them. That's when we come back.
Here we go with the majority deciding to bestow an honor on somebody who is totally, in my view, unworthy.
On Thursday, the Legislative Black Caucus in the House criticizing a pair of resolutions to honor President Trump and the late Charlie Kirk by naming roadways after them here in South Carolina. The bestowing of the name of roadways has been one of those things that we try to do to honor people. And, you know, one of the arguments that came up was this was being done the same week as trying to honor the life of a South Carolina native in Jesse Jackson. And so there is a move among Republicans to let's figure out how many people we can name Republicans, how many roads we can name Republicans out of in South Carolina. Again, it is an honor that's bestowed upon certain people, but as Representative Gilda Cobb Hunter said, it seems to be the fact that the Republicans are having the majority and trying to stack up with as many names as they can.
And right-leaning names. This is really the most predictable fight in politics, when you have a symbolic gesture become an ideological battleground. But when you look at who gets honored, that's where it really starts coming into play, that fight. Generally, you're looking at national leaders. You're looking, not at national leaders. You're looking at local recognition, or someone who is a national leader, but is ideologically more neutral, or as someone who has advanced human rights over a period of decades or something like that. It's hard to find a major city without a Martin Luther King Jr. drive, right? And that's one thing. And it's also something that took place in large part after he passed away. This, on the other hand, is taking one person who hasn't and another person who is more ideologically divisive and failing to account for the late Reverend Jesse Jackson.
Yeah, and of course, this still needs to be approved by the Senate, too, but did draw the ire of Representative Gilda Cobb Hunter there in the Legislative Black Caucus, because, again, you made that point. This was happening during a week where one of South Carolina's native sons was being honored.
And again, we have bigger fish to fry in South Carolina. You know, we're dealing with infrastructure funding. We're dealing with rural roads and port logistics, with eviction ceiling. We need laws that are going to lead to real outcomes for ordinary South Carolinians. And when we have some free time, let's name some roads. But this should not be the partisan focus that it has taken up.
But keep in mind, it is election season, and Republicans or Democrats are trying to, right now, at least push themselves as far as they can to the right and to the left so that they can make the case for those people who are going to be voting for them in the Republican and Democratic primaries in June.
And coming up next on Connect to the Capitol, we have one of those people running for office. Alan Wilson, the Attorney General, gubernatorial candidate, coming up next. All right, welcome back to Connect to the Capitol here on Watch Fox 57. As promised, the Attorney General, Alan Wilson, joining us in the studio now to talk about a couple of issues of the day. And Catherine Glenn Foster, of course, on the road, is joining us for this interview as well. Alan, it's been a while since we've had you in here, so I'm glad we got you back.
It's great to be
back. Been a few months. You were a regular here for for a few weeks there, but a lot to talk about right now. Aside from your run for governor, there are some things going on that you're tending to in your role as AG right now. Earlier this week, we had a chemical spill up in Fort Mill. Silfab Solar, a lot of people got involved, but you were one of the first to jump on that and said, we got to shut this thing down. People are in danger. So what's the latest with that?
Well, I've obviously been working closely with the Director of DES, as well as the Administrator for the EPA, Lee Zeldin. In fact, I spoke with Administrator Zeldin, who was up in Washington, D.C., both last night and again this morning. They've made this a priority. In fact, EPA is moving up. They're coming to South Carolina to Monday. So they're going to be on the ground Monday with SILFAB, along with the folks from the Department of Environmental Services. I've been getting lots of calls from concerned families, concerned parents. Obviously, it's close to nearby schools and communities. Our number one goal is to ensure that the public health and safety of all the families in the area are protected, to get the answers to all the questions. We're going to let the environmental regulators do their job. My office stands ready to support that and consider all legal options available to us, but to ensure that they get all the answers that they want. That is what we're looking to do right now, and then obviously go from there.
Yeah. Now, one of the issues we've talked about on this show before, and I know that you've also publicly had a position on too, is removing a bill at the State House that would remove the religious exemption from vaccinations for young students, because we're in the middle of this history-making measles case. So, since we have our other attorney involved in this interview, our constitutional attorney, constitutional law attorney, Catherine Gunn Foster, get involved. We've talked about this. That bill's not dead yet, but it is obviously an effort to do something to raise some awareness about vaccines in this state. But let's talk about some of the mechanisms involved here. We're talking about religious freedom and restricting it.
Well, look, I have a long history of defending religious liberty when it comes to people, how they operate their business, how they raise their children. These are foundational core principles of our republic that I will always defend. And what I've told people is I will always support religious exemptions for families who don't want to pursue vaccines. However, I would remind people there could be consequences or outcomes to not getting your children vaccinated. You have that right to exercise and practice your faith the way that you want to. But obviously, if your child comes down with an illness that would have been prevented by that vaccine, then you might face a quarantine issue or some repercussions of that. But again, it's a balance. Public health and safety, religious liberty. There might be a little tension there, but I think we should accommodate that, always.
Yeah. Catherine, that's along the lines of our conversations here for the most part.
It really is, yeah. So I had a question on Iran, actually. We've seen tensions rise across the country and a lot of leaders with strong reactions on both sides. Governors don't address foreign policy, but they do deal with issues like National Guard readiness and cybersecurity, economic impacts. So as governor, or how would you address that? What role do you think a state like South Carolina should play when tensions rise internationally?
Well, that's a great question. And again, you're right. Governors don't have a direct impact on foreign policy, but foreign policy has a direct impact on the states. And so that's something that's worthy of talking about. First, I would remind people that, the first question is, does the president have the ability to do what he's doing in Iran? I would argue under the War Powers Resolution, absolutely. The War Powers Resolution was written the year that I was born, and it anticipates that obviously the Congress declares wars, but there hasn't been a war declared by Congress since World War II. That means that the president needs to be able to react and act quickly, because sometimes Congress doesn't have the ability to react to a situation, especially a situation involving a imminent hostile situation. Well, imminent hostilities can happen in ways that people didn't anticipate in 1973 when that authority was given to the president, or that restriction rather was given to the president. So obviously, while I support what the president did, people are probably asking the question, as you just did, how does that impact South Carolina? How does that impact the role of governor? First off, the governor is the commander-in-chief of the National Guard in South Carolina. I'm a 30-year combat veteran, a graduate of the United States Army War College. We have studied these issues, how geopolitical issues like what's happening abroad in the Middle East can have impacts here on South Carolina. They have tremendous impacts on South Carolina, and governors do have a role. First off, on the public safety side, we have lots of narco-terrorism. We have lots of international criminal organizations, Mexican drug cartels, engaging in human trafficking. It ends up here in South Carolina. They engage in fentanyl trafficking and other illicit drug trafficking that is all originated south of the border. And by the way, the Chinese government is very much in lockstep with the Mexican drug cartels. On the cyber side, and I mentioned earlier, enemies, they don't just fight us out on open battlefields in foreign lands. They can basically fight us and attack us here in our own states, which is why cybersecurity is so vitally important. We have a cyber center down in Aiken County near SRS, Savannah River Site, which is also a national security issue. We have partnerships with higher education, academia like Carolina, Clemson, USC Aiken. You have local governments, state governments, the National Guard working to basically bring all of these siloed organizations and sectors together to address the issue of cybersecurity. So like people in the Middle East or in Russia or in China can harm you here in South Carolina if we don't have a secured cybersecurity policy in place. And not just cybersecurity, but they can engage in all kinds of other types of criminal activity like misinformation, disinformation campaigns. They can engage in attacks on our children, trying to molest or prey on our kids. Obviously, they're using advanced AI to morph images of children and morph images of elected officials. Obviously, you can do all kinds of things. So what happens on the international stage can have a direct impact. So the governor of the state has to know how to utilize those National Guard assets, those cybersecurity assets, to not only work with local law enforcement, but how to engage with federal law enforcement officials who protect our borders and protect our skies and protect our security apparatus in the cyber arena.
So from an office of an attorney general or a governor, you do have purview over things like what we've talked to you about before, hate crime. A hate crime law, a proposal that's still stuck in a House committee right now. It's been passed by the House before, but always gets hung up in the Senate. We had the recent case of the Richland County man who was charged under their ordinance, who pled guilty to a federal hate crime here. That has now reignited some conversation about it at the State House about, okay, the feds did this because South Carolina hasn't. Where do you lie on, if you were governor and a hate crime bill came onto your desk, would you sign it? Or how would you want to see it structured?
So the first thing is, I've worked with solicitors and sheriffs and law enforcement officials all over South Carolina discussing this bill. I think South Carolina is one of 2 states that doesn't have one. The first thing I would say is, if you want to have a law that gives a law enforcement official or a prosecutor an enhancement penalty, meaning someone commits an assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature or attempts to kill you, but they're doing so because you fall within a protected class. As long as we're not changing the underlying crime, I'm okay. If you want to say someone attacked you because of what you look like or what faith you practice or of your sexuality or whatever, and you want to give us the ability to add an additional 5 years, that is an enhancement. That does not offend me from a practical application. Now, other people would say it doesn't really reduce crime, it doesn't deter crime, and that's a completely separate argument. But I don't want to create a situation where we're treating people differently based on what they look like or who they are. But if you want to give law enforcement the ability to add additional years onto someone who did it because they are attacking someone because of a protected class, that does not offend me from a prosecutor standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Catherine, any follow-up?
I'm sorry, what was that, Brian?
Go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, I think that certainly makes sense. There are still ongoing questions about how that gets applied for a lot of folks, but when it's presented as an enhancement, that certainly helps people to kind of understand that at least the core law isn't changing, which may be part of what could eventually get that through. I wanted to turn to some of the broader policy questions, actually, because one of your messages, one of your campaign platforms has been about being tough on crime, standing up for South Carolina families, children especially, and making sure that they're protected in public spaces, including critically online. And that's been echoed by some of the other candidates. Now, in your position as a leader in a lot of polls, being the front runner, a lot of times as a front runner, campaigns can become a little bit more about avoiding mistakes instead of presenting a bold vision. So what are you doing outside of talking about some of these big picture issues that do affect our state? How are you going to continue to present that bold vision in new ways to reach your audience?
Are we talking specifically in relation to law enforcement issues, what I've done as Attorney General, and how I will carry that on as governor, or are we talking about just any issue?
Both, ideally. Law enforcement being a huge part of the platform, but really expanding beyond into everything that you might be touching as governor.
Yeah. Let's start with law enforcement. Law enforcement's a core function of government. It's the number one function of government that people can relate to government. Keeping people and their families safe. So let's start with that. Obviously, I'm very proud of the fact that working with law enforcement officials all over the state of South Carolina over the last 15 years, and what they're doing on the front lines is resulted in South Carolina having the lowest violent crime rates in 30 years. That was just published by SLED a few months ago. That is one thing. As Attorney General, we created the State Human Trafficking Task Force. South Carolina was one of the worst states before that in combating human trafficking. Now we're the gold standard. We have increased the number of prosecutors and investigators and forensic analysts out there seeking online predators by over 400%. That has led to over 2,700 arrests of online predators. We're out there advocating for bond reform, judicial reform, things that give law enforcement and prosecutors more tools to protect families. So I've had a working relationship with the legislature. We've been able to move the needle on a lot of these issues. As governor, my aperture of issues, my portfolio would expand to economic issues, issues involving energy, issues involving infrastructure, issues involving education, healthcare, mental health. And again, as the governor, we have a very broad vision for what we want to do in each of those sectors. I have talked to members of the legislature. What they're looking for is someone who is ready to lead on these issues, not just be reactive. Like say, send something to my desk and I'll sign it. They want to see a leader who's going to go out there, go from one corner of the state to the other corner of the state, advocating on TV and in local papers and at local stump meetings all over South Carolina to bring the vision that people want to see South Carolina reach to those communities. And that's what I'm going to do as governor. My running mate, Mike Rickenbaugh, and I have come up with a plan that every single thing that we do is going to come down to one rule. Does it make living in South Carolina more affordable for South Carolina families? And does it make businesses more profitable in our economy here in South Carolina? If it hits those two things, then those are the policies we're going to support.
All right.
The foundational issues that affect every single South Carolinian, we certainly appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And like every issue comes down to the family, whether it's what bridges you're driving across, what schools you go to, whether you have enough energy to cut the lights on in your house or your business, everything comes down to families and people in our state. And that is going to always be our North Star on policy decisions that we make.
All right, good stuff right there. That's the last word for this segment. Thanks again for coming in. I know you got just a few things to do. So always good to have you in here. Alan Wilson, the Attorney General, and of course, a Republican candidate for governor. We'll be right back on Connect to the Capitol.
It removes the religious liberties of the people in South Carolina, and it's just outright un-American.
But we also have to weigh the importance of the parents who send their kids to school that is supposed to be safe for them.
The shot or not, the state's measles outbreak has already hit a history-making mark. This week at the State House, the war over vaccines leading to a marathon hearing. You know, this measles outbreak really, it shows that vaccination policy isn't just theoretical. It's when two important principles collide, public health and our First Amendment religious liberty. These are both incredibly important. We have to have a certain vaccination rate to hit herd immunity. So the challenge really is finding the right balance, standing by our principles, but also making sure that enough folks are vaccinated that these diseases and outbreaks don't spread.
And one of the biggest issues that has sprung up and made this so loud has been kind of the reverberation of what we saw with COVID-19, when there were so many mandates, you have to do this, you have to do that. And there's that spirit among especially certain areas of the state, in the upstate area, especially where the measles outbreak began. There's a whole spirit of, you can't tell me what to do. And yet at the same time, we want to make sure that our students and our teachers and our communities are safe.
Yeah, and no decision has been made on this. It's a tricky situation. The constitutional issues, of course, with the religious freedom. I think it's a case where they're gathering more information and seeing what they can do with this, if anything. There's no hard and fast date on when they'll take this up again. Quick sad news to share. The death of Alvin Green. Folks around here might remember him as one of the most unlikely candidates ever for U.S. Senate in modern memory. Alvin Green, just 48 years old, won the Democratic nomination for the U.S. Senate back in 2010. No one knew who he was, not even state party leaders. Very quirky guy, very memorable. Books were written about him, songs produced about him. Jim DeMint, the Republican candidate, went on to victory, though, in that particular race. Alvin Green laid to rest on Friday, just 48 years old, but what a story. Before we wrap up, Dave, quickly, the state budget is coming up this week.
The House of Representatives is taking up the budget this week. The total budget, $42.8 billion. Coming from South Carolinians, that's about $14.8 billion in the general fund. And this is going to be an important part. We'll have more on that this coming week. Hope you have a great rest of your week, everybody.
That's right. We're going to see how it all pans out next Sunday here on Watch Fox. Have a good week.